Yeah, so I can't remember how many articles we actually read between us. It was something like 200 to survey what was going on in trust. But predominantly we found a lot of it was around trust in organisations or trust in the information source, less about how to seed trust within messages. And so this is part of what we're planning to take forward as a research project in the next few months or so. But it always talks to the importance of trust within agencies before, during and potentially after recoveries where it tends to get questioned. But the really fabulous thing about trust is that when you ask publics whether they trust organisations or government, we tend to get low reads. So this is data from 2015 here in Australia. We have a 35% trust rate in the government, and we've stayed fairly consistent from 2006 around that. In the US, this is data from 2015. I'm not sure what it would be now.
2017, I think.
This data?
Oh. Pre-inauguration.
Okay. Yeah. So, you know, it's interesting. But whenever these trust surveys are done and they ask, you know, do you trust journalists? No. But do you trust doctors? No. But do you trust your doctor? Implicitly. Do you trust your lawyer? Definitely. So when we personalise, there's a much higher trust rating than when we institutionalise. So it's always a fascinating part when you think about trust. I think, as Mark mentioned, AIDR run a number of different kinds of events. And last week, Craig Fugate, the former administrator from FEMA, was out sharing some insights. And as luck would have it, he also wrote a blog talking about the importance of trust, which was a critical piece around public trust and crisis response strategy. So you have the full blurb here, but I guess a lot of this talks about work that can be done within preparedness, work that can be done within an event, and then also the importance of communicating transparently within an event. One of the interesting points that Brooke, I think, made when we were talking about tornadoes was that, or actually maybe more terrorism events, when the information comes, we expect people to just act, and trust is given quite swiftly by communities within events because they have no choice, and so they have to trust that information and respond to that information. But the questioning of trust will happen on the back end of an event when people have more time to say, well, why didn't you tell me that earlier? And then I could have done X, Y, and Z. Or, you know, so we start to see the questioning of trust happen within the recovery space. And we wanted to take things a little bit away from natural hazards kind of space and show you a couple of examples perhaps where trust is shown differently. Because trust is more easily ascribed by people to other people, it's, I guess, important to think about the role that our leaders play within this space. And so I wanted to show this video of Malcolm Turnbull responding following the Sydney terror raids a couple of weeks ago. So as you're listening to this, can you keep in mind some of the elements that you think might show trust or encourage people to trust the government or the emergency response space here? So
we have the finest security, police, intelligence services in the world, working 24/7 to keep you safe. The major counter-terrorism operation, which has occurred overnight and is continuing, and operations are continuing, is an example of the way in which terrorist plots are uncovered and disrupted due to the extraordinary intelligence services we have and the fine cooperation they have with our police and security agencies. Every day we're working tirelessly to keep you safe, and last night's disruption operations are a very good example of the way in which our agencies are delivering our commitment to keep Australians safe from terror.
So I guess just setting up some of broad ways of how we might look at trust. more generally. And now flipping back to the emergency management context, this is from some focus group research that we conducted, and a comment from a focus group participant around what they do and what they look for in information. So having a quick read. Often when we run our focus groups, we'll give participants different kind of informational messages to evaluate and critique and see what they look for in one message from one agency versus another message from another agency. And as Brooke has mentioned, there's been research done that converging messages is useful, but sometimes there are some people who are sceptical, and when they see too much of the same thing, they're like, what am I missing here? What aren't you telling me that I should know about, and that I'm questioning to drive different kinds of decisions? And so I might take this deep dive into information searching that might not necessarily be useful here. But different information sources play an important role around verifying work and trust, and that verification role of trust in social media is really critical. Some of the literature that Brooke and I looked at last year talks about how trust is really important and is achieved when you have transparent communication. So you're talking not just, agencies aren't just saying this is what we want you to do, but here's how we arrived at that decision. So this is the transparent process we used, and reflecting on that rationale is a really important driver. That congruency, we mentioned that already. Willingness to share personal information can increase trust when you're in group level kind of communication, which, you know, when you share a little bit about yourself, people are going to feel more open. That trust within the disaster space can influence the positive behaviour, the behaviours that we're looking for. That it can also influence blame and performance evaluations following an event. So, you know, I think a few people have said to me who are more in the responder space that 3 to 4 days after an event has occurred is that space where the communities start to attack what has happened. So that notion of blame and being evaluated by lay publics is a critical space to navigate. And this is from the final one of trust can reduce perceptions around risk and then reduce preparedness. It's some work where out of Europe where there's mitigative actions that communities or councils or organisations have taken to reduce the impact of flood. And so because there's so much trust in the infrastructure that it can have a negative effect of reducing, a flood's not really going to affect me because we've got these great levees or we've got these great, infrastructure around us and they're not going to be affected. And so I don't need to feel vulnerable and therefore I won't necessarily take the preparedness action. So when there is that mitigative response that comes through, understanding how that might change trust can be important things to think about. There's some other research that we conducted in partnership with SEQ Water. We explored trust in information sources from a range of different organisations. So we looked at SEQ Water, local councils, the Bureau, media, QFES, Queensland Police, Main Roads, and an insurance provider. And we asked survey participants to talk about their trust in information sources, and that, I mean, it was fairly high, even for insurance providers. But when we did some further analyses of this, you can obviously see that QFES and QPS have really high ratings. But we looked at the relationships across each of these and between each of these organisations, and it showed very strongly that SEQ Water and local councils were highly correlated. So whenever people trusted SEQ Water, they also had high trust in local councils and vice versa. And so it's important to think about trust not necessarily, which you do automatically when when I asked you that question before of how do you seed trust before an event, thinking about trust collaboratively is also a really critical piece for communicating within events. And then I think that can also play a role following events as well. So again, back into a little bit of theory land. When we were looking through a lot of the papers on trust, we saw a predominance of work that explored trust in the information and in the information source that was there. So this was evaluated around provision of best information to support decision making, provision of truthful information about an event. So those two elements are what drives people's trust in the information. But when we look at trustworthiness of organisations, these are the three kinds of elements that are critical. So the organisation and its employees' ability to respond or deal with this, the organisation and its employees' integrity, the values that drive the response, and then benevolence. Does the organisation and its employees, do they care for me? Do they care about the outcomes that are important to me? And so I guess thinking about those three elements as the pillars for communicating are probably useful ones. And you can see from the Prime Minister's video that he did talk about ability quite strongly there, maybe touched on integrity and perhaps, I guess, assumed benevolence or care, but it was very strongly emphasising ability. So what we'd like you to do now is, knowing that trust is often questioned after an event, is to think about a time when stakeholders lost or questioned trust in your organisation, and have if it's, don't go deep into therapy land here, but how did you respond? What could you have said or done to prevent this from occurring? And what, what if anything could your organisation have done? And then what, if anything, could other organisations have done? Reflecting on that collaboration around trust. So we'll spend a few minutes if you want to chat about this with other people, and with those of you who are from the same organisation, and then we'll come together and share some of those insights.